Hello and welcome to another Earnestly Eston book chat. Today let's spend a few minutes with History in English Words by Owen Barfield. This book was originally published back in 1953, and I decided to read it because I've heard of it. I've seen it referenced in other places, particularly around the evolution of human consciousness, which is a topic I'm interested in, and the evolution of human consciousness, specifically how it can be reflected in language and the use of language and in words. History in English Words. So yeah, History in English Words has been on my reading radar for quite some time. Owen Barfield was a member of the famous Inklings from the middle of the 20th century, a literary and intellectual discussion group that included also C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Lewis and Barfield, I think, were really great friends. Wikipedia just says here, Barfield has been known as the first and last Inkling. He had a profound influence on C.S. Lewis, and through his books, The Silver Trumpet and Poetic Diction, dedicated to Lewis, an appreciable effect on J.R.R. Tolkien. Their contribution and their conversations persuaded both Tolkien and Lewis that myth and metaphor have always had a central place in language and literature. So yeah, History in English Words. What this book's about is basically that, right? It's taking a look at the English language, and different words come into the language at different times and in different ways and for different reasons. And so the book is divided into two different parts. The first part is called The English Nation, and the second part is called The Western Outlook. Towards later in this chat, I'm actually going to talk about how this book itself illustrates the changes in language that we've seen from the time this book was written in 1953 to the present day. And then also I have a couple of examples from The Breakfast Club, the 1985 John Hughes film, The Breakfast Club, also illustrating how language changes, and it can happen over a relatively short amount of time when the meanings of words changes and when new words enter into the vocabulary. So yeah, this first part, though, is discussing the English nation. So he kicks off this discussion about what he calls the Aryan languages, or the Aryan nations, he calls it, which is really an outdated term. What he's talking about actually is the Indo-European language family, which spread out over all of Europe. Most of the European languages today descend from Indo-European languages or Proto-Indo-European languages, as well as the languages of like ancient Greece. Greek is a language, is a Indo-European language. The Slavic languages are, and then some of the languages of Persia, Iran, modern-day Iran, and India are also Indo-European languages. So this language group really fanned out over a vast geography of Eurasia. And we know this because of the way that it can be reconstructed, how certain words are very common in maybe Sanskrit, and in Slavic, and in Norwegian, and in German, and in English, because they're all related. They go back to an original root sort of language structure. So we understand this today as more of a language group rather than a national group, and I'm going to talk about that more here in a bit later on in this chat. But English itself, just pulling that out, England, Great Britain started out as a Celtic speaking. The Celtic languages are also Indo-European languages, but supplanted then later by Anglo-Saxon, this Germanic type of language, also an Indo-European language, but then heavily influenced by some other factors, namely French. From the Norman conquest in 1066, French was spoken in the law courts as well as among the aristocracy. So lots and lots of the words in English language come from French, and English has continued over the centuries to borrow from French, because French is based on a Latin language, and so Latin, a lot of times Latin words and Greek words, so Greek words from the ancient Greek sometimes will go from Greek into Latin, and then from Latin into French, and then from French into English. That's how it has sort of happened historically, but there have been lots of other ways where these words come into play. Namely, I think the point he makes in the book is that as society changes, as culture changes, we need to develop new language, right? New words to describe new states of being or new outlooks and things like that. So in the book, he talks about this quite a bit, how this happens. One thing that happened, like in the Middle Ages, for example, the theology around in the Middle Ages is really working around the language of individuality, which did not exist before, right? So Christianity concerns itself with an individual person, an individual sort of soul. And so working out that language took quite a while, it took centuries to do. That language of individualism, that self-language that we refer to ourselves today, didn't always exist in English or in other languages either, but in English for sure. So that's had an effect. Terms come from sports. Terms come from all sorts of different institutions, the arts. Then also events that happened like the Reformation. So the Protestant Reformation that occurred also, sort of expanded this sort of individualism that was already in development throughout the Middle Ages as far as the theology goes, as far as the developing a language of, me-ness, my inward state, that really took off again with the Reformation, with new words coming into English to reflect that, and then we come across the scientific revolution in like the 17th century, where these scientific words start appearing in English, and then their meanings expand. One word that I'm thinking of is like electric, and so electric, if it appears before a certain time, would only sort of mean the generic sort of, when you rub two pieces of paper together, there's that electric force that you get. But now electric has lots of other meaning. I can be considered to be electric, meaning I have a lot of energy, That sort of concept didn't always exist. There is a quote here that I thought I would read that really sort of illustrates a particular word. In this case, the word is quality, and how the word, was invented. And then has been used really ever since. And the quote says this: "Thus, the word quality is used by most educated people every day of their lives. Yet in order that we should have this simple word, Plato had to make the tremulous effort, it is one of the most exhausting which man is called on to exert, of turning a vague feeling into a clear thought. He invented the new word," and then it's a Greek word, which I'm not going to try to pronounce, but it means whatness, as we might say, or of what kindness, and Cicero translated it by the Latin qualitas from qualis, and language becomes a different thing for us altogether if we can make ourselves realize, can even make ourselves feel how every time the word quality is used, say up on a label in a shop window, that creative effort made by Plato comes into play again. So, yeah, he's saying here Plato had to invent this word because this word that meant whatness, there was not a word in Greek that meant whatness or of what kindness. And so Plato invents a word in Greek, which then the Cicero in the Roman era finds useful, and so translates it into a Latin word, qualitas, which then, comes to us into English as quality, which means this same thing. But if Plato had not gone down that road and created the word itself, we would not have that word, nor would we really have a good grasp of that concept, which now we can express without even really thinking too much about it, right? But without that concept and without that word being constructed, we wouldn't be able to. So I hope that sort of makes sense. So I wanted to touch base on a couple of things about the book, though, that illustrates how things have changed since this book was written in 1953, and that is Owen Barfield's use of the term Aryan. So Aryan nations, Aryan races, he uses this a lot to describe the Indo-European speaking peoples. And in his sense, I gathered, he's talking mainly about the Indo-Europeans that come up through Greece. He sort of seems to discount what he calls the southwestern branch of this, which would be the Persian, Iranian, and Indian branches, which today we think of more as the Aryan. Aryan has a different meaning to us today because of how the concept of an Aryan race, or a pure Aryan race, an originating race, got used or has been interpreted throughout the middle of the 20th century, specifically in World War II, and continues on to this day with sort of far-right groups and things like that. So, he frames the Indo-European speaking peoples and in terms of Aryan races. And I don't think we don't do that today, right? We don't think of it in those terms. He says here, so this is from the book itself. It says, how different is it when we come to consider the Teutons? He means the Germanic-speaking peoples. When we have abstracted all the Latin words, the French words, the Celtic words from our vocabulary, the English words which remain are all Teutonic, for we ourselves are a branch of the Teutonic race. He's talking about the English people, and the Teutonic race. It's really a language group more so than a sort of biological racial group. And so we don't really think of race, because race has taken on a different meaning to us today, perhaps, than it was when he wrote this book back in 1953. I looked up Aryan languages just to see what I could find, and it says here, Aryan languages was also used by 19th century linguists to refer to Indo-European languages as a whole, but the scholarly use of this term in this sense ended between about 1905 and 1910 and is obsolete in modern linguistic literature. However, it continued to be used in this sense in the early decades of the 20th century by authors writing for the popular mass market, which would have been the case here. So this book really illustrates the use of Aryan languages, Aryan races, as really an obsolete sort of term that we would not use today. Our understanding of Indo-European linguistic groups does not really revolve around race and sort of cultures that moved in and displaced another culture, for example. Lots of people in the world speak English, but English-speaking people haven't necessarily gone in and moved out the existing population. It's just some people have adopted English in certain places for various reasons, if that makes sense. Okay, so before I run out of time, I did want to illustrate something from The Breakfast Club that I think is really cool. The Breakfast Club, a movie from 1985 and directed by John Hughes. There's a couple of scenes in there that really illustrates a new word coming into English. And the first one that I'm going to talk about is sushi. One of the characters, it's lunchtime, and the kids, are getting their lunches out, and she is a wealthy girl, and so she's showing her status really by pulling out this sushi. The other kids don't know what sushi is because it hadn't pervaded the culture yet, like it has now, and so she has to explain in that scene what sushi is to the other characters. And then there's another scene where they're trying to kind of like pull one over on the principal, and they talk about like she can dehydrate, meaning again the sort of the wealthy upper class girl can dehydrate, and the principal doesn't quite know what that means because dehydration and getting individually dehydrated hadn't really come into popular consciousness yet. And so one of the other characters says, "Oh, I've seen her do it, sir. It's very gross." So he lets them go do their thing, right? Because he doesn't really quite know if she dehydrates, what that would mean. Now, of course, dehydrating is a common sort of term that everybody would understand. Anyway, I think I will stop the chat with that. Of course, I could say lots more, but let's stop the chat there. My next chat is likely going to be The Inhabited Island by Boris and Arkady Strugatsky. So until next time, take care.